Welcome, everybody. My name is Erin Sikorsky. I am the director of the Center for Climate and Security, and I am thrilled to be with you all here today to launch the Climate and Security Advisory Group's new report, Challenge Accepted, a progress report on the Climate Security Plan for America and recommendations for the way ahead. As many of you probably know, this isn't your typical think tank report, right? Drafted by only experts, but instead this report represents the views of a community of practice of national security leaders deeply concerned about the security risks posed by climate change. In producing this report, we're also happy to have the partnership of the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW University, who has been a longtime partner and supporter of the Climate and Security Advisory Group. For me, I was, still serving on the National Intelligence Council in 2019 when the first Climate Security Plan for America came out. And I remember thinking at the time that the report was both very impressive and very ambitious. And I can tell you, sitting here today, seeing the amount of progress that has been made on these issues in just a few short years is a testament to the network of the Climate Security Advisory Group, to bipartisan leadership in Congress, to commitment from civil servants in the government, and of course now the leadership of the Biden administration. As the report notes, the US government in the past year has rightly prioritized demonstrating climate security leadership and assessing climate risks. From the executive orders we've seen, the summits of world leaders, the national defense authorization bills and the provisions within them on climate change and climate security, the slew of high-level analytic reports that came out late last year from the National Intelligence Council, from the Defense Department, these all demonstrate this commitment. Of course, we wouldn't be here today, though, if we were all done. There's much more to do. And as we noted in our press release this morning, it's a job well begun, not a job well done. In the past few months, two grim developments have underscored the challenges facing the United States when it comes to climate security. In late February, the UN's IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its latest assessment, which found that despite efforts to reduce risks, climate change is already causing dangerous and widespread disruption and affecting the lives of billions of people worldwide. The report's grim findings, though, were mostly pushed out of the headlines by another grim development that began a few days earlier. Of course, I'm talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yet the two stories are not separate. A potent advantage that Putin has in the conflict is the world's dependence on oil and gas. And it's precisely that dependence, if continued, that is contributing to the dire climate security risks of which the IPCC report warned. One thing that has come into sharp focus since the first report was released in 2019, climate security risks aren't only a future worry, they are here today. And you can take just a quick geographical tour of the last year, from the fires in California, which have meant National Guard hours spent fighting fires have gone through the roof, to the record temperatures that contributed to water and energy shortages this summer in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, which then resulted in violent street protests, to the drought and desertification that undermine food security, governance, and potentially give a boost to extremists in East Africa, to the unprecedented warming in the Arctic, which is leading to more commercial and military activity, and then other geopolitical developments have made coordination and collaboration in the region increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Therefore, the report we're releasing today focuses heavily on adaptation and resilience, ensuring the US can weather the security risks that are already here. At its core, right, the national security apparatus in the US was created to keep America and Americans safe. Doing so in the 21st century means tackling climate security risks. As multiple secretaries of defense, from James Mattis to Lloyd Austin, have recognized. The new report we released today, Challenge Accepted, is a roadmap for policymakers to do just that. It is endorsed by more than 70 US national security experts, including retired generals, ambassadors, and senior intelligence leaders. To dig into the report in more detail, I'm really pleased with the group we've assembled on the virtual stage here today. I'm going to run through brief introductions of all of them and then turn it over to each of them in turn for a few additional remarks from each of them before we open it to questions from the audience. So here to provide some welcome remarks, first is Craig Gannett, who is the president of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation. We'll then turn to Honorable John Conger, my colleague and the Director Emeritus of the Center for Climate and Security and the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, and without whom this report wouldn't be here today. Then we'll have some reactions to the report from General Ron Keyes, who's retired from the U.S. Air Force and serves as an advisory board member at the Center for Climate and Security, as a former commander of Air Combat Command, and also Honorable Sherry Goodman, who's a senior strategist and advisory board member with CCS and a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Craig to welcome you all here today.
Thank you, Aaron, and greetings from Seattle. Let me just say a few words about the Henry M. Jackson Foundation because it's relevant to this report. The foundation was created almost 40 years ago to carry on the legacy of Senator Henry M. Jackson of Washington State. That legacy included protecting the environment, as evidenced by his work on the National Environmental Policy Act and on national security. About 8 years ago, we at the foundation decided to focus a lot of our attention on climate change, and particularly the intersection of climate change and national security. And we did so because we didn't think that intersection was receiving enough attention, and because we saw it as an opportunity for bipartisan action, a hallmark of Scoop Jackson's career. Not long thereafter, we partnered with the Center for Climate and Security because we saw it as having the credibility to bring attention to this issue, and because we saw it as having the tenacity to make sure that real progress occurred. And we were correct. The 2019 report sets out recommendations across 4 broad areas, and today's report provides a measure of accountability by following up on the progress that's been made 2+ years since. The short version is that the relatively new Biden administration has made great progress in terms of showing leadership, saying all the right things, and that's important. But that's the easy part. The hard part is turning those words into actions, that sort of blocking and tackling, for lack of a better term, within the government to make government do things differently in a timely fashion in order to address the crisis that is bearing down on us. Because if we don't make those adjustments in a timely fashion, the words themselves will not save us. So I'm hopeful that this report will spur the Biden administration to further action, and that in another couple of years, there'll be a 3rd report by the center celebrating a well-executed plan. So thank you for including me, and I look forward to hearing from our experts.
Thank you so much, Craig. So glad you could be with us today. Over to John to give a summary of the report.
Thanks, Aaron. So my job today is to spend a little bit of time. I'm not going to list off everything in the report, but to spend a little bit of time summarizing the report that we're releasing. Challenge Accepted has 2 equally important parts. The first part is an assessment of the progress that was made on the recommendations that the Climate and Security Advisory Group made 2.5 years ago in the Climate Security Plan for America. That's where the title comes from. The 2019 report laid down the challenge, and what's clear over the last couple of years is that the challenge was accepted, but it hasn't yet been met. The second half of our report today offers a set of recommendations to guide future efforts in the climate security space. So first, the progress report looks at the accomplishments of the past couple of years, largely of the current administration, but in fairness, Congress has passed important legislation that advanced these goals as well. Measures the progress against the 33 recommendations in the 2019 Climate Security Plan for America. And in that report, the Climate and Security Advisory Group included recommendations in 4 main categories. The first was demonstrating leadership, then assessing climate risks and leveraging foresight. The third area was in supporting allies and partners. And the fourth was in preparing for climate impacts and preventing them as well. The most concrete progress of all those 4 categories was achieved in the first category. The administration has made climate change a core national security priority. It has published overarching policy on incorporating climate change into defense, diplomacy, and intelligence. It has established positions within the security apparatus that are focused on this problem. It rejoined the Paris Agreement. It pursued climate aggressively in security and international forums. The other 3 categories, however, we give credit for progress, but the work is clearly incomplete. We understand the challenges of time and of resources, and with the administration's first appropriations, bill landing, actual appropriations landing within the last month, there are limits to what could be accomplished. That, however, does not explain all of the shortfalls. We couldn't help but be disappointed that the infrastructure bill, for example, omitted DoD infrastructure, a real opportunity to invest in resilience and in security resilience in particular. In addition, while we've been very encouraged by the administration's commitment to deploy funds to fragile nations to shore up their resilience to climate change and ensure stability around the world, Congress didn't answer the call with its recent appropriations bill, falling far short on those requests. The administration has dropped some balls too. We had hoped to see more aggressive effort, for example, to integrate climate concerns into maybe the State Department's regional and country strategies. We'd hoped to see DoD move out more aggressively on congressional direction from 2020 to develop resilience plans at each of their installations, plans that could have been generating proposed projects by now, but haven't yet been issued. That said, it's clear that with their words and plans, the administration has accepted our challenge. They have intention. Now we look forward to seeing what they're going to do with it. So on the report's second half, it builds on the recommendations from 2019 with 21 new recommendations. They incorporate the previous themes, the 4 categories. So within the demonstrating leadership section, the signatories urge the government to fully resource its ambitious plans. In other words, to show up with the money to do all the things they promised to do. There's a saying in Washington that strategy without budget is hallucination. So we want to make sure that there's actual follow through. It needs to put its money where its mouth is. The outline of that budget request was shared on Monday, and we look forward to seeing the details. Within the DoD budget, for example, the department says that it's asking for $3.1 billion on climate investments, with $2 billion of that going to resilience and adaptation. Other investments going, for example, to increasing the efficiency of operational platforms, planes and trucks and such. When all is said and done, we're going to need to see the details in order to evaluate what the implications are. We call for transparency on metrics. How are they going to measure success? They need to show us how they're going to measure it, and then show us how they're doing against their own yardsticks. Under the leveraging foresight category, we urge the administration to invest in seasonal and sub-seasonal forecasting so we can anticipate the stresses that will drive crises and perhaps blunt their impacts. We also urge DoD to comply with congressional direction to develop those resilience plans at individual bases, ensuring localized solutions are developed. In the supporting allies and partners category, we turn and ask Congress to fulfill the climate resilience and development commitments made by the administration. People don't seem to realize how self-interested development funding is. By ensuring stability in fragile nations where climate stress is severe, we're not only exporting our values, but we're protecting our economy and the global supply chain. Climate change is poised to hit hardest and soonest at those places least able to cope, and is in our interest to help them do so. And then under preparing for climate impacts, we're looking for more investments in resilient security infrastructure. The administration's budget request is a beginning, but recall that DoD alone has $1 trillion worth of real property, and it's going to take a lot to climate proof it. We also propose a national adaptation plan to guide the flow of federal resources and ensure that they're not committed on infrastructure that's vulnerable to climate impacts and that we end up wasting the money we invest. There's much more in the report, which I urge you to read cover to cover. But the bottom line is that in this environment, where there's broad consensus on the impacts that climate change has on national security, and where there's an administration that says all the right things, we need to move from words to deeds and from plans to action. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And I'll encourage folks, you can start, a few people have started putting your questions into the Q&A, and after we talk to General Keyes and Honorable Sherry Goodman, then we'll have some time for Q&A, but go ahead and put them in there now. I think now I'll turn to General Keyes for his remarks.
Thanks. Well, I've been down this long trail since about 2009 when CNA put out a report about climate and catalyst being a catalyst for terrorism issues, etc. What I see now is at least we can talk about it. We can say climate change in the open. We don't have to worry about our budgets being slashed if we say we're going to do something because of climate change. But I think there's, as both John and Craig have pointed out, now comes the hard part. We've done the planning to plan. We've even done the planning, and now it's time to focus on the money. But how much money you spend, and if you look at this last budget request, and it was a budget request, this is not the budget yet. Administration, puts out a budget request, and then Congress is going to have something to say. And so it's a question of how much money you spend isn't important if you don't know where you're spending the money. So what will we spend the money on? It? What are the metrics, as John said? What are we going to fix, and how do we know what's fixed, and who's in charge of fixing it? And in the military, it's you are what the numbers don't lie. You are what your numbers say you are. And so that you need to have a metric of where are we going. One of my favorite quotes from Covey was, the main thing is to keep the main thing as the main thing. So the question is going to be, what is the main thing? What are we trying to do? What are we going to fix first? Because it is a daunting systems engineering problem. But I think that as we went through our report, challenge accepted, there were a lot of challenges that were accepted. But now all the signatures and all the press releases and everything, they really don't fix anything. If everything in that report was A+, except for section 4, we'd still be where we are. In fact, we still are where we are. And so it's a question of in section 4, where you start talking about resilience. What are you going to do? If you're going to build back better, are you going to take climate effects in effect? You're going to build back better and make sure that you have added in what climate might do, not what it does today, but what it can do in 10 years. This has been a long, long road, and we're starting to make progress. But again, money talks, BS walks. And so we have to have that money spent in the right place. And I think we're getting to that. I mean, I worry, and one of the reasons I wanted to be associated with the report and this long slog with climate and security is I worry that sometimes people look at DOD and say, well, DOD can fix this because your job is to protect us. You go, well, yeah, that's true. But the throwaway to DOD is like 1.7% of the energy budget of the United States. That's a very small amount, which means if DOD goes out of business tomorrow, all the climate impacts that our country has, they're essentially still there. Their job is to go to war when called upon, whether that's humanitarian rescue or global vigilance or actual combat, and win that war. And so I think this report, the administration has done a good job of turning the boat, getting focused on what we all have to do. And there are a lot of balls in the air. People say, well, all this does is take focus away from Ukraine. Well, no, it doesn't. We've got to be able to juggle 2 or 3 balls at once. That's just the way the world works. But what I think Ukraine is a good example, though, although it's a terrible happening, it brings focus to what could happen if a supply chain or something else is disrupted when it comes to energy. If you're not energy independent, if you're not in a situation where you have a backstop for whatever your normal energy situation is, That's what climate change is going to do to us. So I'm cautiously optimistic. We're started down the right road. Now it's time to stop talking. Now it's time to plan. Now it's time to measure and get on with the program.
Thanks so much, General Keyes. You're exactly right. Sherry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Erin. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning. First, I want to thank Craig Gannett and the Jackson Foundation for your longstanding support for the Center for Climate and Security and the Council on Strategic Risks. You are so right, Craig, that Senator Scoop Jackson would be very proud of the legacy that he's left and that we're carrying forward in this organization, that you yourself have been very much a part of in your own work at the nexus of national and environmental and now climate security. Scoop had the vision long before climate security was an actual coined a phrase, that we need to protect our natural resources at the same time be able to defend our national security. So I want to thank you and the foundation very much for that. And to the team at the Center for Climate and Security, John Conger, Aaron Sikorsky, and behind the scenes, I know we have Elsa, who has helped put this all together. You guys are each rock stars in your own in your own right, and I want to thank you for that. And General Keyes, you've been my longtime partner on this now. Many years we've been going down this road, and I so deeply appreciate your continued commitment in this field. And you're so right when you say that, you know, this problem endures well beyond the Department of Defense. That's why it's such a major challenge, and your voice in this has mattered so much over so many years. So I want to thank you so much for your continued leadership here. Now, what I want to say about this, where I think we are today on the climate security plans of the Biden administration and our report through the challenge accepted report. There's kind of three points. One is we need to complete the plans that have been directed. Second, we need to fully resource them, and then third, we need to, you know, measure against them and ultimately integrate them into our readiness metrics, finally. So let me just say briefly a little bit about each of those. Obviously, we've talked about all the plans that have been issued by this administration, which go a long way. I mean, if you would have said to me 25 years ago that we were going to train a climate ready force, you know, in the Department of Defense, people would have laughed at you. I mean, you know, it was hard to even get people to talk about environment some 25 years ago, but now climate. So we should recognize we have come a very long way. And that's important. And the momentum is great. And I think we need to continue to seize the momentum, because we are at a sort of unique moment where we have really driven forward a lot of what's been building over the last several decades. And we've got leadership from the top. And we don't know how long the support is going to last, both the enthusiasm and the political will to continue to make these investments. So we need to complete the plans that are out that haven't yet been done. Particularly, I think the military installation resilience plans are going to be very important, because they're going to give us those projects that will help in turn more systematically make our installations more resilient. And then, of course, you'll have to prioritize against those. And then in the other area, I think under the Defense Climate Risk Assessment, where we're looking at what the combatant commands are going to do in terms of operationalizing climate security, I think there's a lot of good momentum there, but we have to keep up and keep that flow down from the broad Department of Defense-wide Defense Climate Risk Assessment down to what the COCOMs are going to do at their level in terms of operationalizing climate security. So we see that translate into their regional security planning activities. And then, secondly, we've got to resource the plans. As John said, you know, the budget is now out there. So There are some good investments, and we don't have to be afraid to talk about climate and hide it under different rocks the way we sort of had to do previously. And I think that's going to be very important, both on the kind of operational energy side. Of course, on the insulation side, that's where there's longest been the widespread bipartisan support. In acquisition, I think we've got to look both at, ACAT 1 programs and at other types of programs and see how climate is being factored into the total life cycle of the acquisition system as appropriate. And then finally, in the sort of human health and the soldier, sailor, airman, marine area, we know that extreme heat and stress and then having to operate in colder temperatures in the Arctic now is going to be one of the human challenges that our force faces. And we have to make sure we protect our soldier, sailor, airman, and marine as they are asked to operate in these continuing challenging environments. And I know that Deputy Secretary Hicks called that out as an important area for investment in 23. So we'll be looking at that as well. And then finally, third, obviously, you've got to measure, you can only manage what you measure. And, in my 8 years at the Department of Defense, one of the things that people might say is kind of boring, but was the most enduring thing that we did was we created the first set of environmental security metrics to manage at that time how we were cleaning up our bases, complying with environmental laws, conserving natural resources, preventing pollution, investing in technology. And again, we need those metrics now to hold ourselves to account and also to be able to report. So DoD hold itself to account and then report to the wider community about how it's doing. And that, of course, then includes also advancing the predictive capabilities. I'm very pleased I see some significant increases in some of the technology R&D programs, CERTA, BSTCP, now combining with the Operational Energy, I think, Improvement Fund and some of the others. And I think that is going to be very important. And then I hope we have to make sure that the technologies that are coming through those programs also get picked up and don't fall through the valley of death, as sometimes happens, get picked up, whether they're either an installation level or an acquisition or manpower type of technology personnel, so that we can really take advantage, particularly in the key areas where DoD either is electrifying its fleet or deploying the microgrids, moving towards decarbonizing the energy system and protecting the human health of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine. And without, just end on a note by reinforcing that Putin's war in Ukraine shows us that energy can be weaponized, but fossil energy can be weaponized against innocent people. And that should give us ever more urgency to advance the energy transition, to decarbonize our energy sources, diversify, and at the same time secure them so that we combat the climate crisis. At the same time, we are also combating authoritarianism around the world. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Now we can move to questions from the audience, and I see we already have some in the Q&A. And I think the first question we'll ask builds on something that Sherry was talking about the role of technology and how do we use perhaps even existing assets such as ISR and UAVs to help respond or assess phenomena instigated by climate change. What are the opportunities to leverage technology either in new ways, existing technology, or where do we need more research and development in new technologies to manage some of these climate security risks? That can be to any of you who might like to take that one.
Well, I think that there are huge opportunities in technology innovation. I just spent the last 2 days at a conference that Battelle organized with many of the DOE and other labs on innovations in climate resilience. And they're particularly looking at how they can help both DOD, other federal agencies, the Department of Energy, and the commercial sector more broadly by innovating across. And I think there's a great overlap between what we need in sort of information dominance, both on the battlefield, but also to combat the climate challenges. And we see some of that, for example, in the Arctic as a good example, where we need to have better systems to both understand methane sources and emissions in the Arctic region, but we also want to be able to understand other sources of emissions for national security purposes. And you might be able to use sometimes some of the same systems to do that. So I think there's a growing connection between the capabilities we'll need in ISR powered by AI and other new technologies that are both, remote sensing, air-based and space-based platforms.
Thanks, Sherry. John or General Keys, did either of you want to jump in on that one?
I'll just say there's been a long history of leveraging DoD information and intelligence community information for the benefit of the environmental community and looking at some of those challenges. The specifics going forward, we'll have to see what initiatives are out there. And I know the questioner said he had a particular, idea. So we can explore that and we'll circle back with him to talk about it.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add that there's a lot of that goes on that people probably don't see, but NOAA and NASA and a lot of the unmanned things in the ocean. Certainly, there are a number of big wing airplanes that are looking at climate change. And when you get down to a humanitarian issue, then you've got here in our country, the National Guard rolls in and provides military capabilities. So there's a lot of that technology that is being pulled down, and now one of the big challenges is to integrate all of that and what does it mean? We get lots and lots, terabytes and terabytes and petabytes of information every day, and now it's a matter of, is there a place that can pull it all together and improve our forecasting and improve our preparation. So I think that's coming along. As far as future technology, of course, everybody will come knocking on your door with whatever technology they happen to have, and there are some concerns that I keep hearing about the Valley of Death, and my position always has been, well, maybe some of them shouldn't get across the Valley of Death. I mean, if they don't fix an operational need, speaking as a military man, if they don't fix an operational need, then I start to be less enthusiastic about, well, why should I spend time on it? So we do need to integrate, but I think that's probably has come along a lot further than a lot of these other things that we need to do.
Thank you. All right, the next question is a question about how do we think about identifying and prioritizing hardening of existing energy infrastructure, right, to climate physical risks, or what other adaptations do we need to make to energy infrastructure? I assume in the national security sphere, particularly, to be able to withstand physical risks from climate change. So I think this is really an installations and energy question there. So maybe John, if you want to start us off, but
Sure.
Others can jump in as well.
Sure, and I think we harped on the lack of installation resilience plans for a reason. In many respects, each individual location is going to be different. They're going to have different challenges. Some are going to be more resilient than others. Just like if you have above ground wires and below ground wires, there's a different vulnerability to storms. So they're going to have to assess that. They're going to have to understand where their single points of failure are, and they're going to have to rectify those. It's more location based than holistic in that context. But there are holistic problems too. They're all going to have to, frankly, I know it's not the topic of our conversation, but all of those all the utility companies are going to have to cyber harden. And that's another element of resilience that they're all going to have to deal with. But I think in the immediate case, as we contemplate the impact of natural disasters and the increasing likelihood of extreme weather, higher winds, and so on and so forth, looking at the grid in each specific critical area is going to be important to figuring out what that to-do list is and prioritizing it.
Great. Thanks, John. The next question I want to highlight is one about the role of international climate finance in advancing national security. And what are some ideas on how we can strategically advance meaningful appropriations here, considering, as John mentioned, how dismal an appropriation there was in FY22. I'll jump in on this first, and then I'll let other folks join in as well. I would just say, I think the framing that John provided is really an important framing, right? That the reason to focus on climate finance isn't just because it's the right thing to do, but it's because it's in US national security interests, right? A lot of the climate security risks that we discuss are risks in places that are already unstable or in conflict, have real governance challenges, right? And lack the capacity to adapt to the climate shocks that are coming their way. And those places of instability and conflict can have spillover impacts on the United States national security. And so it's in our interest to get ahead of those risks and provide financing so that they can adapt and they can be resilient to these shocks coming their way. And I think the Biden budget request does actually request quite a bit of money for climate finance. Of course, it is now up to Congress then to provide that funding, but I was pleased to see President Biden and his team continue to push on it and live up to our commitments. That's the other thing. We've made a lot of commitments on the world stage about this, and part of having legitimacy on that world stage on these topics is to follow through on our commitments. So that's my perspective on that, but welcome any other folks on the panel to jump in.
Maybe I could just, oh, go ahead. Thanks. Share a story that underscores that. I was last week with a lot of people from the Middle East, North Africa region, and one of the exciting opportunities that is occurring now to reduce water stress in the Middle East, supported by the Abraham Accords and the increased collaboration between Israel, UAE, and Jordan, is called Project Prosperity, whereby Jordan is providing solar energy to Israel in exchange for desalinated water. So Jordan needs water. It's a very water-starved country, and Israel needs more clean energy. And it's supported by the UAE. And that's an exciting example, I think, of ways in which it may not be even climate. I don't know if the funding would be coded as climate finance for that. But and it may not be U.S. money, but it is supported by U.S. support of this agreement. And when Secretary Belkin was in Israel just earlier this week with those leaders, and I think Bahrain and Egypt as well, another new project was announced, supported by USAID on Israel Palestinian water cooperation in Gaza, which again is helping secure water supplies and water security in that water-starved region. And I think there are many more prospects to address water needs and also clean energy and also food security across that region, which is exacerbated by climate risk, made worse now by the Ukraine crisis because they are such important, Russia, Ukraine, important wheat exporters, as you know, particularly to the MENA region. So I think we need to drill down in some of these cases and help support those particular projects where there's actually opportunities for increased collaboration among countries and actors in new ways today, particularly addressing water, food, and energy security.
Great, thank you both. The next question takes us back to the Ukraine issue. So Russia's Ukraine invasion has highlighted the dangerous dependence on Russian gas for much of Europe. We're talking a lot about energy security. Some are taking the view that this means renewables, others saying it's fine to ship LNG. Bearing in mind our comments about climate change increasing instability and conflict, what are our views on what is a wise energy security path for Europe and elsewhere? Sherry, General Keys, you want to jump in on that one?
I wouldn't propose to try and tell Europe how to run their business, but the issue at home, I think, for us is, we've started because we are a industry commercial for-profit country. We started shipping gas out of the U.S. overseas, which of course undermines our competitive advantage in the fact that our gas was because it's not a global market like it is for oil. And so that undermined our competitive advantage, where we had a gas cost us about 1/3 of what it cost everybody else. But in the the pursuit of taking care of your fellow man, we go, we've got to ship this over there. We've got to offset what Russia is not going to send to Europe, or Europe is not going to accept from Russia. I'm not sure that's even doable. It's a 1.5 billion cubic meters of gas. I don't know how we can absorb that around the world and get it to because it's got to go from somebody to somebody. So I think those are, the choices are, if you don't want to do nukes, nuclear power. If you don't want to do nuclear power, if you don't have enough hydropower, and now you're into gas. But gas really doesn't solve your problem, because it's still fossil fuel. It's a lot less intensive than coal, but it's still, and oil, but it's still fossil fuel. So time is wasting, because now they're behind the 8 ball, and whether they'll have time at this point without serious disruption. We worry about them, but gas was what, $2.50 a liter. So that would translate to us being $10 a gallon over here. Our heads explode if that happened to the United States. So I think there are a lot of things that have to be looked at and say, well, what can they do? And right now, I think the UK is planning on exporting a lot of their oil in the North Sea to Europe, even more than they do now. So I don't know what their answer was. I'd be very popular if I actually had a good answer.
Well, I'll just add, I think it's a matter of timing. I think in the short term, Europe needs more oil and gas, particularly gas, to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and gas. Norway, England, others producers in Europe are stepping up, and the US is doing its best to help fill some of that short-term gap. Germany, for example, has already announced that they want energy efficiency and energy saving measures by everyone in the nation. And, we could all do that. We could reduce our driving speeds to 60 miles an hour and take other, energy efficiency is the fourth fuel. So if we all took these conservation measures, we could begin to save more dramatically. And I think that Germany as a country is going to start to do that. These are, then we have to think about accelerating through the energy transition and really doubling down on moving towards renewables. I mean, personally, I think Germany should relook at its decision to abandon nuclear power, but that's not my decision to make. They've got, a number of issues to look at there, but everyone's going to be looking at how do we move towards better baseload renewables, more conservation and efficiency measures in the medium to longer term, and stepping up other sources of safer, secure supply, and also decarbonizing in the gas sector. There are more things we can do even while we still need a gas supply to reduce the emissions from that sector.
Thanks. The next question here I want to highlight is one that gets at, I think, what we're going to see with the new national defense strategy, which is expected to focus a lot on China, and the discussions with the national security strategy. But how do we think about connecting the importance of funding climate security initiatives against the backdrop of what some core DoD decision makers think would take resources away from competition, say with Russia? and China. And I know I can already hear John Conger's voice saying walk and chew gum at the same time. But I want to hear from others about how we do that. And I would say I don't think they're actually separate, right? That you need to think of them together. But let's hear from all of you about how we think about this question. John, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think it's important to recognize that the funding that DoD, for example, devotes towards what is characterized as climate investment is actually mission investment. The money that they're putting in infrastructure to make it more resilient, they were already putting money in infrastructure to make it resilient, and it's been recoded to a degree, and it's been increased to a degree, and that's good. It doesn't take away from mission capability with respect to China or Russia to make a better aircraft engine. If you give a commander more miles per gallon, you're probably going to get more miles over fewer gallons. But that increased capability is being coded as climate investment. And so be careful to characterize it as taking money away from the fight, when in fact, it is actually going towards the fight.
I would just add that, all the forts and ports and airfields and places like that, they're just like the villages and towns and cities across the United States. And what we're worried about is we need to be able to live there. We need to be able to train. We need to be able to mobilize. Once we're mobilized, we have to deploy. And in most cases, we're going to have to reach back. So having a stable platform, if you will, so that you can, in fact, execute your military mission, I think is important. So I don't think that part takes away. And again, if you're more efficient, if you figure out how better to wash your jet engines, you can save 1% a year. 1% a year on KC-135 is a lot of money. In fact, they found, this is one of those anecdotal things, they found by taking the windshield wipers on the KC-135 and have them at rest vertically rather than down like they generally are in your car, they're saving 1% per year on fuel costs. Now, 1% is not a lot, but when you're flying a fleet of KC-135, that's a lot of money saved. Now, is that a climate thing, or is that an operational efficiency? What you could check off both boxes in there. So I think we need to be careful about those things. I worry a little bit about when we start doing R&D on what are called dual use technologies. And you find out the dual is a little more over on the commercial side than it is on the DoD side. But DoD has got the tail pinned on a donkey to go and do R&D on this because people feel like, well, DoD has got a lot of money. They might as well be doing this. Now, of course, they have a day job that they have to spend that money on. So I think there are a number of places where I just don't see, there's a lot of focus and there's a lot of talk, but I don't see, and I didn't see long ago, that taken away from our primary mission.
Thank you. There's a question here about one of the recommendations in the report, which is to, quote, initiate a climate security research agenda. And the question is, what types of research would be most beneficial to DoD on this topic?
Can I jump in on that just real quick, just to frame it? That was in the original report, right? The 2019 report, and the goal was to have the security apparatus feed the requirements into the civilian R&D sector to push some of those priorities. Things like small modular nuclear reactors that might be helpful at DoD bases, or microgrids, or a whole host of other things in the energy and other spaces that DoD can leverage was part of what that was getting at.
Great. Thanks, John. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we hit a few last questions here. There's a question about the State Department, right, from Bob Barnes. What specifically does the Secretary of State need to do to drive implementation of the CSPA recommendations about integrating climate security in regional and country plans and in the State Department security assistance and conflict prevention programs? I'm going to provide a few thoughts on that, but then we'll turn to the rest of the panel. I think a couple things from what we've seen from State Department in the past year is one, obviously there's been a huge focus at state on the mitigation piece ahead of the COP meeting last fall and the great work of Secretary Kerry and traveling the world to get countries to raise their ambitions. And all of that is extremely important to climate security risks in the long run. But as I talked about when I first opened, and as we talk about in our reports, there are a lot of climate security risks that are already here that we need to focus on adaptation and resilience for today. And that's where this integration into the regional bureaus and assistant secretaries of defense comes in. And I think there are a couple things that need to happen to make that a reality. One is what we talk about a lot about building a climate strong workforce, right? Your workforce needs to have the tools on climate change, on climate security that it can integrate, right? And know how to use those tools. And you also need that priority. You need to hear it frequently from your bosses that it's a requirement. And then they need to give you the resources you need to do that. And I think those two things are what we'll be looking for to help the State Department move this forward. And that we see it in places across state in different ways, in different forms. I think there's just a lot more work still that needs to be done. John, Sherry, Ron, any other thoughts on that?
I have two thoughts. One is, or three. One is obviously the leadership attention really matters. Obviously, we have it on the mitigation side. It's in writing on the sort of resilience building, integration across the regional strategies. I think you have to, secondly, kind of drill down a little bit into some of the statutory and other requirements that drive the different bureaus. For example, the Conflict Stabilization Bureau, now they're driven by the Global Fragility Act. And I know some of you on this call, I see Annalise and others, have helped to insert those environment and climate security requirements into the Global Fragility Act that are now getting picked up and implemented with the new Assistant Secretary there, Ann Witkowski. And I think you could perhaps do the same analysis, across other bureaus at state. And then the other thing I'd say is, and I also want to give a shout out to Andrea Cameron, who I see is also on this, because she ran a terrific program last week on operationalizing climate security for the COCOM levels. And one might envision some kind of analogous State Department exercise where every regional bureau kind of went through its own review about how would it actually, in the state, maybe they don't use the term operationalizing, but sort of integrating into, the regional priorities of that bureau, the climate security needs, and bringing together the various capabilities of both the personnel and others that they need to really address this problem, and then seeking out the interagency support that I think could be very, very beneficial here.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. That's a great idea. I love that idea of a conference. Let's see here. There's a question about how can DoD use and extend its partnerships with third parties to ensure non-DoD owned operated infrastructure is available to DoD when needed. I'm not sure I totally understand that, but maybe those of you who are John understands it.
So DoD on any individual installation in particular relies on civilian infrastructure for electricity. Sure, everybody sort of understands that part, but for water, wastewater, transportation, healthcare, housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can have a resilience inside the fence line, but if the community outside the fence is not resilient, then the base is still screwed. And so how do you build that partnership with the local community to build their resilience in order to make sure that the security mission is still protected? And there are programs that are nascent that are building towards that. There are requirements in law that those communications occur and haven't yet fully happened. The ball is moving slowly in that direction, but there are some good authorities out there that would enable a willing DoD to participate in that. It's a little alien for some of the base commanders to say, you know, I don't get what I want or know what I need from the local community, and I can't tell them what to do. But there has to be a partnership and a communication at a very basic level on these issues in order to move the ball forward.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of a wave of that starting to happen. It's a matter of how do I get my workers to base, or how to get them off the base if there's a disaster, which roads should be built up, all of those kinds of things. I think those are partnerships that we increasingly have started to embrace. I mean, because behind the scenes, as the secretary mentioned, he said, well, maybe some of this resilience ought to be in the base realignment and closure discussion. And I'm waiting for the day when the commander of Langley Air Force Base has to go and talk to his Virginia friends and say, you know, we're knee deep to water here, and so we're going to move to higher ground. I mean, there may be that challenge may be before us, and the sooner we get started on resilience to give us time to get to the mitigation, the better off we're all going to be.
Thank you, General Keyes. We have just 3 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is actually ask each of our speakers, if they don't mind, if you have one takeaway from this report that you would want policymakers to walk away from reading it, what would that be? And what would you be looking for perhaps maybe a year from now to see that they have done? So we'll go in the same order we've spoken. John, then General Keyes, then Sherry will get the last word.
So for me, it's putting your money where your mouth is, but making sure it matches. So if the adaptation plans that have come out, and we say, please resource your adaptation plans. If the adaptation plans have a series of metrics that say, here are the 5 things we're going to do, that's how you measure whether it's enough money, because they put money against those priorities, not necessarily how big is the total pot, because you can recode things in a number of different ways to make the number seem big. But did they do the things, and did they fund the things that they promised in their plans? That's the biggest way to measure it in a year or 2 years.
Thank you so much. General Keyes?
I would just say it's in a short phrase, how do you know? When I would go around and visit my bases, it's always exciting because you get to go into a place where some young airman is going to show you something. And generally when you walk in, you say, hi, how are you doing? And invariably they say, great, General. And my response to that, which got around pretty quickly, was, how do you know? And shortly, you know, once that gets through the network, it says, when the old man comes in, he's going to ask you, he's going to say, how you doing? And if you say great, he's going to say, how do you know? So you're going to figure out, how do you know? So the question is, how do you know? Well, because you told me to do this, this is what I'm doing, and this is how good I'm doing it. And so I think if the focus on that is important, because otherwise we're riding off in all directions. And I'm not sure we have a focus on what are we trying to do here, because everything ought to go back into it. I mean, another quick story is that when we write the air tasking order, every one of those desired points of mean impact have a thin blue line that goes all the way up and connects to the president's desire to, this is what the end state we want. And so we need to show that it actually funnels back up toward the task at the hand. And I think sometimes in our enthusiasm as people, we get over enthusiastic and forget, oh, where were we going? This looked like a good road to take, and now it's a dead end. So I guess, again, I would just underscore, how do you know?
Great, thank you. Sherry?
Well, thank you. I'll just, reinforce what General Keyes and John have already said by, we need those metrics. That's what's going to enable us to know how well, what progress we're actually making on plans that have actually been resourced, the budgets, and then the completion of the outstanding plans that are already there. So I say, as you said, I think, Aaron, it's a job well begun, and now we need to keep moving that ball forward and seize the momentum we currently still have to make as much progress as we can, over the next few years with the team that's in place now. I think with a lot of enthusiasm to do that. So Thank you to all of you who have joined, who are serving now. We really appreciate your hard work, and to those of you also in Congress and elsewhere who are going to help make sure this gets done and hold us all to account.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Elsa's put the link to the report in the chat if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, and all the signatories. But thanks again. We'll post this soon, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.